Two queens, one lie, and 2,000 years of propaganda. In one corner, Cleopatra, the woman who seduced Julius Caesar, ruined Mark Antony, and killed herself with a snake. In the other corner, Marie Antoinette, the woman who told starving peasants to eat cake and bought diamonds while France burned. We know the stories, we've seen the movies, we've heard the insults: seductress, spendthrift, traitor, whore. But here's the problem. Almost everything we know about them was written by the men who killed them. Octavian didn't just defeat Cleopatra's army, he wrote her biography. The French Revolution didn't just cut off Marie's head, it printed the pamphlets that justified it. And that's what this channel is about. We take two historical figures, strip away the mythology, and ask the only question that matters. Who got a worse deal from history? Not who was stronger, not who was smarter, who got lied about harder.
Because every versus has a hidden story. And the hidden story is usually more interesting than the one everybody already knows.
So, a Macedonian pharaoh versus an Austrian dauphin. Both became the most famous woman of their age. Both were destroyed by propaganda machines they couldn't outrun. Both are still misunderstood today. This is Cleopatra versus Marie Antoinette. 5 rounds. Uneven, unfair, exactly like history itself. Round 1, the smear. Whose character assassination was more effective? Start with the headlines, because the headlines are where the damage lives. Cleopatra is remembered as a seductress, the exotic temptress who bewitched 2 of the most powerful men on earth, using nothing but her body and a perfume budget. That image was manufactured almost entirely by one man, Octavian, later Emperor Augustus, who needed a foreign villain for what was really a Roman civil war. You can't tell the Roman public you're fighting a fellow Roman general because you both want to be dictator. But you can tell them you're saving the Republic from a dangerous Eastern queen who's turned that general into a lovesick puppet. It's not a power grab, it's a rescue mission. Poets under Augustus, Horace, Propertius, Virgil, dutifully wrote Cleopatra as a drunk, a whore, a fatal monster. That version stuck for 2,000 years. Shakespeare repeated it. Hollywood perfected it. Elizabeth Taylor made it look great in Technicolor. And nobody stopped to ask, wait, who wrote the original script? The real Cleopatra spoke at least 9 languages, according to Plutarch. She was educated in mathematics, philosophy, and astronomy. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in nearly 300 years who bothered to learn Egyptian, the language of the country her family had been running since Alexander the Great's generals stole it. A treatise on cosmetics and medicinal remedies was attributed to her name, though scholars still debate whether the author was truly Cleopatra VII or another woman of the same name. She managed an annual tax revenue that reached 12,000 talents, turned a bankrupt kingdom into the wealthiest state in the Eastern Mediterranean, and personally commanded a fleet at the Battle of Actium. When she met Julius Caesar, she wasn't a helpless girl needing a savior. She was a 21-year-old monarch in the middle of a civil war, and she had herself smuggled into his quarters inside a linen sack because she understood something most diplomats never learn. A dramatic entrance is worth 10 diplomatic letters. Rome didn't fear her beauty. Rome feared her balance sheet. Marie Antoinette is remembered for 4 words she never said: let them eat cake. The phrase appears in Rousseau's Confessions, written around 1765, describing an unnamed great princess.
Marie Antoinette was 10 years old and still living in Vienna at the time.
There is 0 historical evidence she ever said it. But the phrase crystallized something the French public already wanted to believe: that their Austrian-born queen was a frivolous, heartless spendthrift who laughed at their hunger. The real Marie Antoinette was 14 when she was shipped to France to marry the future Louis XVI. 14. She didn't speak fluent French, she had no education in politics, history, or statecraft. She was a pawn in a marriage alliance between Austria and France, and her entire job description fit on one line: keep quiet and produce a male heir. While Cleopatra was debating philosophy with scholars, Marie was being scolded for playing with dogs and caring too much about dresses. She wasn't given a kingdom to run, she was given a costume to wear. And yet this was the woman who donated generously from her personal allowance to charitable causes.
She established a home for unwed mothers at Versailles.
She patronized the Maison Philanthropique, a society for the aged, widowed, and blind. She adopted orphan children and raised her own children to serve peasants at meals. She championed the composer Gluck over the Italian opera establishment and personally supported the inoculation of her children against smallpox, defying court resistance. None of this made it into the pamphlets. The pamphlets preferred something else entirely. Anonymous publications called libelles that portrayed the queen in degrading, fabricated scenarios designed to destroy her reputation. They called her the Austrian bitch. 2 propaganda campaigns. Rome called Cleopatra a dangerous enemy. France called Marie a punchline. And here's the thing about being called a dangerous enemy. It means they took you seriously. Being called a punchline means they didn't even bother. Marie takes the round. Round 2, the downfall. Whose destruction was less deserved?
Here's where the stories stop rhyming. Cleopatra's downfall was geopolitical. She bet Egypt's independence on an alliance with Mark Antony. It was a calculated gamble, and for a decade, it worked. Egypt got territory. Antony got money and grain. Everyone was happy until the other Romans showed up. When Octavian defeated them at Actium in 31 BC, the game was over. The following year, with Octavian's army closing in on Alexandria, Antony killed himself. Cleopatra followed, though nobody is certain how. The famous asp bite story comes from Plutarch, who hedged by noting that the real truth nobody knows. Strabo suggested poison, possibly applied by a hairpin. Modern scholars lean toward a self-administered toxin, not a theatrical cobra smuggled in a basket of figs. The snake makes a better painting. The poison makes better history. Either way, she chose. That's the point. She was the last person in the room who still had agency, and she used it. Marie Antoinette's downfall was a masterclass in blaming the nearest woman. France was bankrupt, not because of her wardrobe, but because of decades of war spending, an American Revolution the king had bankrolled, and an aristocratic tax exemption system that predated her birth by centuries. Her personal spending, while significant, was hardly exceptional by Versailles standards. Half the court was blowing through fortunes on wigs and gambling, but nobody made pamphlets about them. Then came the diamond necklace affair of 1785. A con artist named Jean de Valois used the Queen's name to defraud jewelers of a necklace worth 1.6 million livres. Marie Antoinette had absolutely nothing to do with it. She had personally turned down the necklace on 2 occasions and told the jeweler that France needed warships more than diamonds. The court acquitted her. The public didn't. Because the public didn't want a verdict, they wanted a villain. And from that point on, Madame Deficit was a fixed brand. 4 years later, a mob marched on Versailles and dragged the royal family back to Paris. Cleopatra lost a war she chose to fight. Marie Antoinette lost a narrative she never wrote. In some ways, the narrative is harder to survive because you can't surrender to a rumor. Marie takes the round. Round 3, the legacy. Whose real achievements were buried deeper? This is the round that never appears in the movies because competence doesn't sell tickets and administrative reform doesn't look good on a poster. Cleopatra inherited a failing state. The Ptolemaic dynasty had spent the previous century in decline. Corrupt administrators, Roman interference, famine, a family tree that looked less like a tree and more like a wreath. She stabilized the currency, reformed the grain distribution system, negotiated trade agreements across the Eastern Mediterranean, and expanded Egyptian territory into parts of modern-day Lebanon and Syria through her alliance with Antony. Egypt under Cleopatra was, according to Stacy Schiff's biography, probably the wealthiest single kingdom in the Mediterranean. The Smithsonian described her as incomparably richer than anyone else in the known world. She wasn't a love interest, she was a CEO with a navy. Marie Antoinette was no administrator. Nobody had trained her to be one, and nobody intended her to be one. But her cultural footprint was more sophisticated than history acknowledges. The Petit Trianon and the Hameau de la Reine, her mock rustic village at Versailles, with its working dairy, mill, and farmhouse, were ridiculed at the time as a rich woman playing peasant. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same criticism people still make 200 years later without checking the facts. In reality, the hameau was part of a broader Enlightenment vogue for Rousseauian pastoral simplicity. It was a functioning estate. The cows were real, the cheese was real. Marie Antoinette was engaging with agricultural labor at a time when most monarchs wouldn't touch dirt. She just happened to do it in a nice dress, so nobody took it seriously. Neither woman's actual accomplishments survived their legends. Cleopatra's economic reforms are a footnote. Marie Antoinette's charity work is trivia. The seductress and the cake lady are the versions that sell. And that tells you everything you need to know about whose stories get preserved. Not the accurate ones, the entertaining ones. Cleopatra's burial is deeper. She built a functioning state and history remembers a bathtub. But Marie's erasure is more insulting. She was never even given the dignity of being called competent at anything. Draw. Round 4. The children. Whose motherhood was weaponized more cruelly? Stop the jokes for a second. Because propaganda doesn't just hurt feelings, it kills. And when it can't kill you fast enough, it goes after your children. Both queens were mothers, and both queens watched their children become instruments of their destruction. Cleopatra had a son with Julius Caesar, Caesarion, the rightful heir to both Rome and Egypt, which made him the most dangerous teenager in the ancient world. After Cleopatra's death, Octavian didn't exile the boy. He lured him back to Alexandria and had him killed. His advisor, the philosopher Arrius Didymus, reportedly told him, "Too many Caesars is not a good thing," a cold play on Homer, and possibly the most chilling career advice in recorded history. Caesarion was roughly 17 years old. It was a political execution, efficient, calculated, and merciless. But it was quick. Octavian didn't need to make it hurt. He just needed it done. Marie Antoinette's son, Louis Charles, was not granted that mercy. After the king and queen were imprisoned, the revolutionaries took the 8-year-old boy. They didn't kill him immediately. That would have been too simple and too clean. They threw him into a cell in the temple prison and handed him to a cobbler named Antoine Simon, who had been tasked with re-educating the child into a good citizen of the Republic. They subjected the boy to systematic abuse and degradation, forced him to denounce his parents, taught him to shout obscenities about them, and broke him down piece by piece. And then, the ultimate cruelty. They forced the terrified child to sign a document containing fabricated accusations against his own mother. Accusations so vile that they drew gasps of disgust even from the Revolutionary Tribunal. They used that document at her trial. They broke her heart before they took her head. After Marie was executed, the boy was left alone in his cell. He lived in filth, covered in sores, with almost no human contact. He died of tuberculosis on June 8, 1795, at the age of 10. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't a symbol. He was a child. And they destroyed him to prove a point about his mother. Caesarion died because he was dangerous. Louis Charles died because cruelty was the point. Marie takes the round. Round 5, the exit. Whose death was turned into a bigger lie? How a woman dies in history determines how she's remembered forever, and both deaths were stage-managed, just not by the women themselves. Cleopatra died in August of 30 BC at 39. Whatever the method, she chose it. She chose the timing, the setting, the dignity. She dressed in royal regalia. She ensured her surviving children were sent away first. Even Octavian, who wanted her alive for his triumphal parade through the streets of Rome, was denied the satisfaction. The last pharaoh of Egypt exited on her own terms, and Octavian had to settle for a painted effigy of her carried in the procession, a snake on its arm, because by then the story had already hardened into myth. The woman chose agency. The empire chose a prop, and the prop became the only version people remember. Marie Antoinette was stripped of everything. They took her husband, they took her children, they took her closest friend, the Princesse de Lamballe, killed her, and her head was placed on a pike and carried to Marie's prison. They put the queen on trial for treason, and for the fabricated accusations her own tortured son had been forced to sign. Charges so grotesque
that they backfired even among the revolutionaries in the courtroom. When she was found guilty, they cut her hair. They put her in a plain white dress, the color of mourning for French queens, but also the color of surrender. They tied her hands behind her back. She didn't get a closed carriage. Her husband had been permitted one 9 months earlier. She got an open cart, a tumbril, dragged through the streets of Paris while the crowd screamed at her. On the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. Her last recorded words, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur, je ne l'ai pas fait exprès." Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose. An apology. After the slander, the pamphlets, the fake quote, the stolen necklace she never stole, the execution of her husband, the separation from her children, the destruction of her son, a reflexive, instinctive courtesy to the man about to kill her. Cleopatra died like a goddess. Marie died like a criminal. And only one of them earned that ending. Marie takes the round. The verdict. So whose legacy got twisted harder? On paper, Cleopatra. Her distortion is older, more global, and more structurally embedded. 2,000 years of art, literature, and film have reproduced Octavian's propaganda almost unchanged. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra is beautiful. It's also a Roman perspective with better poetry. Elizabeth Taylor's 1963 performance is iconic. It's also the seductress myth in widescreen and $100 million of studio money. The real woman, the polyglot economist who ran a kingdom more efficiently than most of her male contemporaries ran a dinner party, barely exists in popular consciousness. But Marie Antoinette's distortion cuts differently. Cleopatra was twisted into a villain, which at least implies power. You don't write epic poetry about someone you consider harmless. Marie Antoinette was twisted into a fool, a vapid, cake-eating airhead too shallow to notice a revolution happening outside her window. That's not a demonization, that's a dismissal. And in some ways, being dismissed is worse than being feared, because there's nothing left to recover. Nobody writes prestige dramas about idiots. Nobody composes operas about a woman who supposedly didn't understand bread prices. The propaganda against Marie Antoinette was so effective that over 200 years later, we still mock her. We still repeat the line. We still treat her name as shorthand for oblivious privilege. And almost none of it is true. Cleopatra lost her legacy to the most powerful propaganda machine of the ancient world. Marie Antoinette lost hers to a sentence she never spoke, about a pastry she never mentioned, in a conversation that never happened. The asp, at least, is dramatic. The cake is just contempt. If you want to know who really held the knife, don't look at the executioner. Look at the man printing the pamphlets. Subscribe for more history that they forgot to teach you.